an excellent day at Watches and Wonders Miami. I'm here to introduce you to this amazing panel run by our moderator, Roger Ruegger, about how to get your Super Collector All Access Pass. And without further ado, I'm going to leave you in his excellent hands. Please enjoy the session ahead of you.
Also from my part, welcome to the panel. The moment we're struggling a little bit with acoustics, I try to make as much eye contact as possible. So if you look at me very irritated, I know that we have to speak louder. So this is how it's going to go. We're all going to use microphones. We have a really, for me, very promising panel discussion, starting with the people that we have on stage. We have Matthew Bain, a consultant, collector, and president of Matthew Bain. He's running an independent dealership based in Miami. Is that correct?
That's
correct. We have Alexander Freeman.
Hello, everybody.
Also collector and co-founder of Watchanista, the popular website, and also a high-caliber collector. We have Paul Boutros, head of Americas for Watches at Phillips Auctions.
Welcome, everyone.
We have William, for me, one of the maybe most esteemed collectors I personally happen to know. You're still with Time Zone, so one of the websites where everything began. I remember my first profile was Time Zone in '95, '96, and we have Pascal Ravissou from the FHH in his role as the International Development Director and Secretary General of the Cultural Council at Fondation de la Haute Horlogerie, which is the parent organization for Watches and Wonders. Louder? Closer, thank you. Oh yeah, I can hear that too. Why did no one look at me irritated? That was your role. So, I think as a much more personal introduction of the panel that I have, I usually start with the question, what are you wearing and why? So what are you wearing today and why?
Hello everyone. So I'm wearing a 1980 two-door Submariner Snowflake, blue dial, because I love it. And then that's the rule number one as a collector. I wear what I love.
Occasionally that's all that it takes. If you love it, buy it. Matthew.
I'm wearing a 1950s Longines, kind of a big watch. It's called the Big Indian, and it was used by the British military in India. And I love the watch. Also, it's one of my personal watches because it's a big watch, but it has great proportion. I love the use that it was a tool watch and has a lot of beautiful features that you can't see from back there, but it has a 24-hour red indicating for time, and the fact that it was used by the military and has great design is why I personally like it.
Well, today I picked a Patek Philippe 5141G. I thought it was a good fit for Miami. It's comfortable. It's the bracelet, the gold bracelet. It's quite comfortable with the humidity here. The proportions are small, not too big, so it fits well under a shirt. And yeah, I love it. It's a watch that I bought in 2007. I rarely wear it, and every time I have it on the wrist, it makes me happy. So I join Pascal. The most important thing is that as a collector is to be happy to wear the watch you love.
I picked an independent brand's watch, Laurent Ferrier. It's a watch from 2016 in stainless steel. It has a beautiful sector dial, very simple, very classic. Stainless steel for its comfort and lightweight. It's on a blue strap, and blue's my favorite color. It's a watch I haven't worn in a long time, and that's sort of why I chose it.
Hi, I'm wearing a Patek Nautilus. It's one of the cheapest watch from Patek Philippe, and I got it at a very, very deep discount.
And looking at the watches that we have with us here on stage, for me it was important to first set the ground rules as to what makes a vintage piece vintage, what is modern, what is pre-owned. Just to avoid any confusion, the moment we start into actually collecting watches, we have modern timepieces here. Paul, you have an independent brand. I would like to have one of you two maybe make the distinction between what is a vintage watch.
So from the perspective of my employer and my day job, which I work for Philips, the auction house, we classify those watches made 1985 and prior as vintage. And the reason why is that's the era, sort of the dividing line as to when computer-aided design and computer-aided machining came to be in the Swiss watch industry. So prior to that, it was hand sketching, hand design. So that's our simple line in the sand. Pre-1985 vintage, 1985 and forward modern.
Is that different than to what you?
No, actually, I kind of agree with what Paul just said. There's one extra thing. There's a CAD, and there's also the introduction of sapphire crystal in watches. Before 1985, basically nobody was making watches with sapphire crystal.
So,
yeah, and to that point, for sure, when we consider Rolex, for example, any Rolex with an acrylic crystal, non-sapphire, we categorize that as vintage. And 85 is an good approximation for that. It had happened at various years for various models. The first Rolex with a sapphire crystal was actually in 1970, Rolex's first quartz watch. But 85 is a good marker as the average date.
so for me, the interesting thing is if that is the rule, that every watch before 1985 tends to be regarded as vintage and after tends to be as modern, that brings a natural limitation to the whole vintage sector because there will never be more, doesn't it? No. Which is different to cars because you have young timers, you have old cars, you have vintage cars, and there is more or less a constant supply of new old cars. It's different to the watch industry.
We've been collecting watches for 30 years. It's a very young stage of collecting. People have been collecting paintings, art, for 100, 150 years. So we have rules now that may change in 20 years. Today we're saying it's 1985. In 20 years we may say, hey, it was 1969, the year they invented quartz, so it's the year that the first independent made a watch. At this time now, today, it's there. But that line can be pushed by the collectors.
I think that it's already changing, that 1985 rule, because there are some sapphire sport models from the 80s that have become very collectible, and the younger generation are considered them to be vintage. It's already 30 years old. Say in 1970, you had a car from the 1940s that was considered vintage. So, for example, there's a Rolex GMT from the late 1980s. They call it the Fat Lady, and that's a vintage watch now. So I think the rules are already starting to change.
So, William, do you think it's the 30 years period from where you pass from vintage to modern?
No, I'm not making rules. The market is making the rules. The buyer is making the rule. A lot of people think that the word vintage comes from French, 20 ans d'âge, 20 years of age, and actually it's not true. It comes from the French word vendange, millésime, meaning the year that they pick up the grapes for bottled wines. So the rule of what's vintage and what's not vintage is directed by the market. The market decides if something is a vintage or not. And as Matt pointed out, for a 20-year-old, 18-year-old, a vintage watch is a watch that was made before he was born.
But for me, interesting is especially looking at the vintage market. Not long ago, you sold a stainless steel watch for 17.8 million, which still is, considering that we're only into watch collecting for a short period of time. I mean, we went from pocket watches to swatch watches, and from swatch watches to wrist watches, as you know it today. So it's a rather young field, and yet we have already reached prices that go far beyond some of the cars that are in display here. What happened? Is that the ceiling, or is it just the beginning?
So, as William said, watch collecting, for all of us who've been collecting watches for many decades, it's still a very young hobby. Can you hear me? Watch collecting is still a very young hobby. It really began in the early 1980s when pocket watches were what was collected, and wristwatches were usually in the back of an auction catalog and nobody really cared about. Then the rise of the way people wear watches, it really drove wristwatches as being something desirable. And for us, we think the growth that you've seen, at least in the past 10 years, price-wise, is actually quite healthy and in line with other collectible genres like collectible cars, like contemporary art. We think that there's still room to grow. It's healthy growth, and it's just the society is more and more coming to learn about the greatness of wristwatches and mechanical watches in particular, that we think there's quite a bit of growth to come.
Yeah, well, the growth will come. I think what's happening now is that the watches that are in mint condition are the ones that are really climbing to the top, where the mediocre watches are going to kind of stay. But I think there's going to be a big, and there already is, difference in price. Just like you have a coin, a mint coin could be worth $100,000. The same coin in terrible condition is worth $100. And this is happening with the watches. So condition is playing a very important role with the rise, and it's very difficult to find watches that are in mint condition today. So when you do find one on any brand, the price just keeps going up and up for condition.
And it's because what you said, Roger, there's just less and less of these vintage watches. As collectors collected throughout all of these years, they hold on to their great pieces. And trying to find new pieces that are unknown, it's very, very difficult. And so there's less and less. And when a great mint condition example comes to the market, people are going to pay a premium because they know this is their once-in-a-decade opportunity to get the watch.
I think, you see the example here with the cars. It's exactly the same thing. I mean, cars in good condition, good provenance, with a good story, are much more interesting for a buyer than any other model, which is not in a top condition. I mean, it's getting more rare, it's more difficult to find. So at the moment that you spot one of these very exquisite pieces, then you definitely want to go and pay a higher price for it, and you want to have it in your collection. And obviously there is a lot of watches now out there in the market because of the rise of prices, the interest, and so on. But as Matthew said, I mean, to find a one which is in exceptional conditions, it's quite rare today.
How is the industry, which means the watchmakers today, I mean, we all know the Patek campaign that you never actually own a Patek, you merely look after it for the next generation. And also Patek happens to be one of the brands that is still capable of producing and providing spare parts and actually bringing watches back to a almost mint condition or at least restored. But looking at what we just said at the beginning, that we will have fewer and fewer mint or new old stock pieces, which is just a natural way, and at the same time the industry pumping out more limited editions, leading to more and more watches not being able to be serviced or maintained. Has the industry lost touch to the collectors, or are we going to get back to the brands that actually can provide spare parts? Because that's what I think is one of the biggest risks looking into the future. If someone is building a collection, what if I'm stuck with a watch that cannot be serviced, or there are no spare parts left?
Well, of course, I wouldn't say the pitfall, but the huge issue with the vintage collecting is the spare parts, and not only the movements, but also the exterior parts. Finding people who are able to service it is still possible today for the main movements. Even if the brand has disappeared, you can find a watchmaker who would be able to, I don't know, maybe make a part just to make the movement work. But then in terms of exterior parts, then it's much more difficult. So you won't find a dial, for example, or maybe you can have people making pushers, but it's increasingly difficult. And so this is one of the risks for the vintage market, of course, because the brands are not going to make new parts for their old watches, as far as I know.
10 years ago, maybe up to 10 years ago, you will take any watch, any Rolex, any Omega, and you will send it back. I'm talking vintage watches. You send it back to the manufacturer, and they will change everything. They'll change the dial, they'll change the case. Whatever they thought was broken or was not to their expectation will be changed. And the value of those watches dropped tremendously. These are the watches with a second dial that a value that Matt was talking, are not mint, are not from the period. Today, the market is going to the more authentic the watch is, the better it is. So when the dial is turned brown, when the case is original and never been polished, that's what collectors want. So they want those kind of watch, but they expect them to be working like a modern watch. So there's this big problem for watchmakers. How can I fix this if it cannot be fixed? Because parts have to be changed, because dial have to be replaced because they are rotting on the movement. And collectors have really a hard time doing this, and dealers are not helping so much because they cannot find the parts or they want to sell the watch ASAP. So there is an issue with watches, the fact that we want things that are very authentic, but we still expect them to work. In order for them to work, you have to replace parts. So how come this has to be at one point addressed by the brands? How can you keep it the more authentic as possible and at the same time make the watch work?
In the world of collectors' cars, restorations where you find a vintage era part like a rear view mirror and you replace that part in that car that you're restoring, there's no issue. But in the world of collectible watches, if you replace a bezel with a period correct bezel, but the watch appeared in pictures with a different bezel with more scratches, the collector community kind of gets angry and says that watch is not original. Oh, but in this other collecting genre, there's no issue. So at the same time, brands have to rethink of how they're going to treat their historic pieces. The collecting community, I think, is going to adapt to what they expect and accept in terms of a restoration or putting a part that makes the watch functional instead of being unusable.
Yeah, well, I think there's two types of parts that are changed that affect the value. The part that's aesthetic, that we're looking at the watch, it's the face, or like you said, the bezel, that has a major impact on the value. I find when maybe a part that's inside the watch that we don't see is a new part, I don't feel it affects the value as much on the watch. But the aesthetics, like the face, the watch face is 80% of the value of the watch sometimes. And if they replace an old face with a new face, like William said, there goes the value. So it is a tricky scenario today.
And maybe this is also something to do with the young collecting span. Whereas when you do restoration for cars, it's accepted, but not for cars. And maybe it's also because it's a very young market. So people expect to have everything online, consistent, etc. But we all know here that it's very difficult to have a watch working for 60 or 80 years and having nothing change. Right. I mean, it's just virtually impossible.
Well, with the cars, I mean, neither you leave a car in a garage, you don't touch it, so it's like, let's say, new old stock. Otherwise, the car has been used, driven, has been, maybe it's a little bit rusty, and so on. There is also a difference between a completely preserved, so non-restored, and a restored car. In the car, in the car collecting world, if you have a car which is completely original, non-restored, non-touched, so you haven't been doing a paint because it changes a little bit the line of the car, etc., it also has another value. So there is also this kind of separation between restored car or a completely preserved. But obviously, the watch is something that maybe you can keep it in a box, not touch it, or don't use it, or maybe, it's maybe only the geek that opens the movement and can see that something has been changed. Otherwise, yes, it's the aesthetic which is primary and which cannot be changed.
So, trying to summarize what we just heard, as a collector or someone who is interested in becoming a collector, it becomes clear that it's a minefield. And we all heard the stories of that particular yard sale where someone found a new old stock Daytona including paper and box, in mint condition without knowing what he actually bought and paid $50 for it. Unfortunately, that's not the reality. We have difficulties with the condition. We have difficulties with which part belongs to which watch, the brand, the model. So how do we make sure that we can live up to the promise by the seller as well in a world that is much more online than it used before? What can a vintage dealer provide? What can an auction house provide? How do you buy watches in order to not get burned off and buy something that really doesn't work?
I will start as a buyer. You know, the reality is that nobody can assure that the watch you buy is 100% correct, or, I mean, that's the brands will not do it because most of them, they just don't know. They have no records. They have no records of a 1955 watch, what kind of bezel it was delivered with, or if so, if the bezel you have actually on the watch has been changed in between, unless you have all the you know, service documents, which you usually don't have. So
some brands are better than others. We have a representative from one brand in the audience who's wincing in his chair.
No, that's true. But when I say the majority of them, it's actually the huge majority of them.
It's the exception rather than the rule.
Definitely. Even
the scholarship has yet to be made by all the brands. Some have done a much better job. AP is an example. Others have done nothing. Rolex, for example, where all the scholarship is made outside Rolex. Patek is doing the scholarship. But when you end up in a situation where a brand doesn't do their own history or doesn't want to talk about it, you end up in people will fill the void with their own story that will fit their watch. 20 years ago, you could buy a red Submariner, and some people thought it was repainted white ones with red paint. Nobody knew that there were different type of dial for the red Submariner. That was something that was discovered by people, by collectors, studying them and starting to classify them and create the scholarship. And that's also something that's going to be important in the next 20 years. You may buy something that you think is great, and then we will discover that actually it's complete fake that was made in the late 80s, or that you bought something that was so great and so rare.
So to Roger, your question, you know, you looked at me when you mentioned auction houses, and I'm happy to speak from the perspective of auction houses and how auction houses can help, which I had a lecture. I only saw a few of you in the audience for my lecture on Friday, but no. With auction, when a watch comes to auction, we publish a catalog. We expose these watches that are going to be purchased for a month easily at a time. And the watch is subject to scrutiny from the collector community. And it's open to the public. If a watch is wrong, we take in the watch. We have a team of specialists that vet the watch, but we're human, and sometimes we make mistakes. So once the watch is published, the entire collecting community, the trade, they have the opportunity to scrutinize and give us feedback. There's something wrong with that watch, Paul, or by the auction day, the watch has survived the scrutiny of the community. You can bid in confidence that that watch is accepted by the community. In some cases, yes.
In some cases.
In most cases.
No. I'm sorry, but you cannot say this. I mean, you have dealers that have been returning watches for years to auction house after the fact. You cannot say, if my watch is still on my catalog the day I sell the product, it's good. You guys, you're guaranteed. Nobody came to us and told us our watch was a fake. You cannot say that. You have to be, you cannot say we trust the public or the communities to tell us if something is wrong or false.
What my message was is we welcome the communication from the community if something's wrong. And if it survives at the day of the auction, you have good assurance that it's likely to be correct.
At that time, at that second, yes, that watch is correct. But it doesn't tell you that in 2 years that watch may not be correct because something else came up. And then what happens to your watch that you just bought 2 years ago? What happened? I mean, can you go back? I'm not talking, it's not you, Paul.
It's the same for any...
No, of course. But that's a major issue is you buy a watch, the dealer in good faith or the auction house sells you the watch in good faith. Everybody agrees that watch is good. But what happens 5 years later or 2 years later that some guy writes something on the internet that disproves the existing theory? And this has been going on for years in the watch business. What happens to your watch? It was fine when it was a $2,000 watch. It was fine when you were buying a $2,000 GLC and all of a sudden somebody tells you the hands are wrong and you can say, okay, it was $2,000. But when you invest $250,000 in a Daytona, and 2 years later they tell you, well, actually we figure out that these dials were made in Italy in the late 80s, you have a problem.
Which is why I started this question with, it's a minefield. It's also why they brought me, a Swiss, to this panel to just play the neutral part. No, I think that from a collector's perspective, and that's where I'm looking at the audience, because at some point you will have to face an eBay auction with something that you cannot judge if it's real or not. You don't know the story. But as a collector, if you have a watch, try to preserve everything that comes with it, be it the box, be it the papers, be it the story before. If you can tell the story of the watch before, you will most likely increase the value of the watch.
Sure. Yeah. And there's been a lot of changes, I guess, in the auction world and the way we have a vintage watches, but with modern technology. So when watch collecting started in the 80s, like we said, there was no information except the auctions. That's really where we got our values. I'd go to, me as a dealer, I'd go to a watch show and I'd see a watch for $5,000. Then 6 months later, fly over to Switzerland and see the same watch sell for $12,000. And I'd call the guy up, hey, you still have that watch for $5,000? And he said, yeah. I'm like, okay, I'll buy it. And so you really had to keep up with information. Today, with social media, Instagram, the auctions, everything is moving on a very rapid pace. And values are being established super, super quick. I mean, there could be a watch on Instagram right now being sold in Japan right now. I mean, it's super, super, super fast. But the auctions do provide great marketing. You can learn a lot about watches. Going to the auctions, you can preview them, you can look at them with loops. Everybody's allowed to go there. You can also see market trends with the auctions. And this is called Watches and Wonders. So it's kind of like a wonder. Sometimes as a buyer in an auction, you might get a great deal because not the right buyers are there that day, and all of a sudden you got a watch below the market. As a seller, you want two guys that have big egos to show up, and you're consigning the watch, and it could bring huge money. So that's where the auctions are. Me as a vintage dealer, I think compared to auctions, maybe the service is a little different. So you're building a collection, and you're coming to me, you buy 2-3 watches, and also when you want to step up to a bigger watch, you can make trades. It's more probably instant than what an auction, which takes place maybe every 6 months. So, you can do a mix. You work with the dealer, you work with the auction. I think as a collector, it's a good combination to work in both worlds.
I would like to also talk about a personal experience back in Switzerland. You know, we used to go many years with Marco, my business partner. We're going to la Bourse Horlogère de la Chaux-de-Fonds. What do you say? It's like a flea market? How do you say that in English?
Yeah, flea market.
Like a flea market. So you were arriving there early in the morning with a little bit of cash in the pocket. You were going around, checking the people, you know, blocking some watches. I might pass later. And there was really a lot of things, and you could do good deals, very good deals. Still today, but I'm talking about 15 years ago. You arrived there, and they had, as Matthew said, they only had a catalog of a few auction houses. So more or less, they knew what they had, and you could make some good deals, them and you. After a few years, I think it's like 10 years ago, I don't know, not exactly, but like a few years ago, when the internet arrived, and when a specialist site like Time Zone or other, even eBay and other sites. Well, you arrive there, you see one piece, you ask the gentleman, okay, how much is the piece? And then suddenly the guy comes out with a lot of printed pages with prices more or less realistic. And he said, okay, they know the market, they know exactly what's happening, they know how much they want to sell you the watch. And it became like more difficult to make, the good deals, because those days you were going and buying maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 pieces a day, Now it's over. You know, and as Matthew said, Instagram even went to another level. Now it's instant. People publish a nice picture, boom, it's sold in the other part of the world, and it's.
And that's a huge problem. The huge problem is this: you go in an auction, you buy a watch, you put it on Instagram, and 5 idiots that you never heard of say your watch is a fake. Or you put it, I mean, you're laughing, but it happens every day to a lot of people. Matt sells a watch to a guy, and the guy's been his client for many years. The guy is so happy, he's so proud of buying his watch, puts it on Instagram, and 5 guys from we don't know where and whom says the watch is a fake. We decided that watch is a fake. And where do you go from there? Because the watch is not burned, but it's getting burned. Basically, that watch with that picture is then not good. Anybody today is an expert. Anybody with a screen and a keyboard or an iPhone is an expert. And those guys can burn and make watches in an instant because people believe what they see on the internet. It's a sad fact, but that's a fact.
That's true.
And only the brands, I think that only the brands can be the referee. If the mother recognizes her child, that's it. End of story. If the person who made the watch said, this watch we made, there's no problem with the dial, we sold it that day on that, this is our watch, nobody can say anything there. But if some guy says, I'm an expert, this is right, and another guy comes and says, I'm another expert, this is wrong, who to believe? And on the age of internet, this is what's happening.
Yeah. How many brands can, we spoke about it like a few minutes ago, how many brands can actually go and cut and say, okay, this is right, this is wrong?
Stick to the brand that can do it.
Yeah, but it's really a handful. No, yeah, even.
No, I'm sorry, Omega is doing it, Vacheron is doing it,
Yeah.
AP is doing it. A lot of brands are doing it. The only thing that the brand that doesn't do it is Rolex.
Yeah.
So, Rolex is not doing it, but Rolex is just one brand. There's like 850 brands to collect. And Rolex is right now so overpriced, but that's a different story. But you end up in a situation where you have brands that give you the tools to make sure your watch is correct. You have basically a brand telling you, yes, I recognize that watch. I made that Omega. I sold it in 1956 in Taiwan, and this is the correct reference, the correct dial, and the correct bezel. Why would you go buy for 10 times the price a Rolex where you have no clue? Because this guy told you it's right, this guy is telling you it's wrong. And people don't see that. And it seems so clear that at one point we're going to hit a wall. And then a lot of people are going to cry about this.
And I think one of the aspects that becomes clearer and clearer, not with this panel, but always, it's we tend to rationalize a highly emotional product. So before we buy it, we try to find many rational reasons to buy it. But at the end of the day, it's as emotional as a category and as a product as it probably can get. And what is very exciting for me, or let's say irritating, is we have tourbillons, we have minute repeaters in precious materials that are not performing as well as a simple three-hand stainless steel watch. So if you try to look at the current vintage market objectively, you're destined to fail, because we have the story that a watch has to tell, maybe whoever owned it before, and there is a disconnect between, let's say, watchmaking art, what we consider precious material. What happened?
The horological art is part of the story, and it is a law of supply and demand. Today's watch buyer, and especially in the vintage market, their lifestyle is increasingly casual. And so the quantity of people buying watches, they have this casual taste that stainless steel, tough diving watches, luxury sport watches just appeals to more people than the horological art type watches with minute repeaters, perpetual calendar minute repeaters, and high complications. There is still a market for those watches, it's just less people want them in general. And less people can afford those highly complicated timepieces. But when, just going back to your comment on storytelling, I mean, for me, the watches I collect, I want watches that tell a story. And if it's a minute repeater, it tells a great story. If it's from a storied brand, it tells a great story. A stainless steel watch, a dive watch, its heritage, its history tells a story. At auction in our catalogs, we tell the story. Whether it's a famous person who owned it, that's what we love to do. We love to shine a light on the greatness of watches. And there are great watches at all price levels, from brands across Switzerland. And this is what we love to do.
Thank you.
I think I just changed my profession. I'm the watch psychologist. And I'll be there to help you, hold your hand, make your decisions. Don't worry about it.
So the watches and wonders, the wonders part is now we also help make career choices. So that just happened live here, a day to remember. Looking also at the watches that we are wearing, we have spent quite a bit of time on vintage, which obviously is maybe the most dominant field to collect watches, but looking at who is exhibiting, looking at what we are actually buying at the end of the day, it's modern watches. It's the watches that are being launched today, yesterday in Basel, in Geneva, that end up on our wrists. Can a modern, mass-produced watch be collectible?
Yes. There's no reason why. I mean, Rolex was making mass-produced watches in the 50s, and they're very collectible today. The way of production is not the reason that we collect watches. Paul mentioned the storytelling that is very important. I'm not into the storytelling at all. I make my own stories with my own watches. But I think that a lot of people are very attracted to this. You buy an Omega Spin Master and you feel like an astronaut, whether it's a 1969 Spin Master or a 2019 Spin Master. So the storytelling is important. Then there's another level now, which is the craftsmanship with watches and the complication. And that's another story to tell yourself to sell a watch. Today, the dominating collectible watches are watches that give you a story. Will they be there tomorrow? Maybe, maybe not. But modern watches are definitely taking a step back.
What I advise people is buy a watch that's meaningful. Buy a watch that you think in 20 years will still look good. Beware of the trend. The watches that generate a lot of noise today, you know what? Maybe 5, 10 years from now, they're forgotten. The watch that's a little bit more quiet, more understated when it's launched, but it has a timeless appeal, 20 years from now, you'll be happy you bought it, perhaps. Less is more.
I mean, how do you know? How do you know that in 20 years?
You don't. You don't buy. You buy what you love.
I mean, maybe a personal story from my part. In 1998, I was interested in buying a Panerai. So all the Panerais in '98 were A series, which nowadays are regarded rather collectible. And I was given a choice between a black dial A series Luminor white dial or a Mare Nostrum. Guess what? I ended up with the white dial version because I said to myself, I never had a white version of a watch, and this turned out to be the worst watch you could buy. So, had I gone for the Mare Nostrum or the black dial Luminor A series, I would have been a lot better off. Plus, and that's where the meaningful stories come into it, it was my wedding present to myself, which after 20 years turned into a divorce present. So, But how do you approach buying a watch that's being released today, maybe as a limited edition? Is it really just buy the watch you like, or is there more?
You go to Italy. I mean, my rule for modern watches is I go to Italy. You go to Italy and you walk the city of Rome and Milan and you look what men and women are wearing, and you know what's going to happen in 5 or 6 years with modern collectible watches. Whatever the Italians are buying, it's basically what's going to happen next. There's a big jet lag between Italy in terms of watch collecting and the rest of the world. And it's not so much that the Italians are buying so many watches. The American market is much bigger than the Italian market. But Italians who buy watches have that taste that nobody else have. And when you see what those guys are buying, you know that in the next 4 or 5 years, this is what you will be buying in America or elsewhere in the world.
I agree, assolutamente sì. So, yeah. Staying with Italy, you know, we were talking about collecting modern timepieces. There is one which I acquired not so long ago, which is the Bulgari Octo Finissimo in titanium. I don't know if it probably won't get value over the years, or I don't know, it's not even a question of money, but at one point, you see one piece, you think that it could fit your collection, you like the way it's made, the way it looks, the way it feels on your wrist. But at one point you said, okay, this can integrate whatever I have, vintage or non-vintage. Could be part of a collection of a certain number of pieces that I own. It can go, you know, it's a giant design. It can, you know, for me it's an iconic watch. It will become, you know, I think that every 20 years there is a major watch that comes out, more or less, for me. This particular watch from Bulgari, it's a statement watch. It's something that will stay over the years. So for me to have it now, to buy it now when it came out, and to cherish for years, it's something that makes sense. So it's not a question of value, investment, or anything. It's really the piece itself, and if it integrates the collection you have.
Well, I'm back to what I say in the opening. Rule number one is buying what you like, but there are many ways of buying. You can buy impulsively, or can you also buy a little bit, you know, in a different way. I have bought, like many of us, probably watches that I thought were the ultimate one, and after a few months or years, this was, you know, probably not the best choice. So we're much more clever afterwards. Of course, but I see myself actually loving a watch, probably not buying yet, but then I still have this itch that comes back and back and back, and then I know if I buy it, I'm going to keep it. It's a keeper. But that's me. So it's very, you know, I think different from one person to another. But
there's a lot of catch and release in collecting watches. You catch a watch and you may release it right away. You buy it, and after a few weeks, a few months, you sell it again. And the internet has made this much more available because you can contact dealers, you can do it yourself. The catch and release is very much part of the process of collecting watches because you have to try stuff. Watches is something that you're going to have on your wrist and you have to like. And if you don't see yourself wearing that watch after you bought it, sell it. And that you may lose some money, you may make some money, but a catch and release process is very important as learning to be a collector.
This is a very nice way for me also to wrap the discussion up as to what our advice to someone starting a collection or interested in becoming a collector would be. I think you summarized it really nicely. For me, I have learned over the last 20 years I've been collecting watches that patience is everything. We are quite often, and maybe that's also one of the mistakes that eBay brought to the whole thing, I tend to look at a watch with if I'm not buying it right now, it will be the last time ever that I had this opportunity. And it's not. 10 years after, they might come back. Or 5 years after I see a better, less expensive. So try to be patient would be one of my advices to someone starting a collection. We usually think that if I'm not buying right now, it's going to be gone forever. With some of the exceptions that we see in the auctions where we actually know this is your only chance to buy and it's never going to come back. But for me, as a regular collector into watches, it's patience. What would be your advice to someone starting a collection?
Always buy what you love, but try the watch on your wrist. Really, that's quite important. Wrist fit, I think, is the long-term satisfaction you'll get out of that watch. And if it doesn't fit your wrist right, you will really tire of it. But also quality. I think focus on quality, the brand, the model, the quality of construction, the story it might tell. William doesn't like stories. I like stories. Quality is very important, and that should drive your the way you purchase, who you're purchasing from, by the seller. Quality, quality, quality.
Alexander?
For me, it's the same. The golden rule is buy what you like. I mean, that's mandatory. Just don't, you know, I never bought a watch to store it somewhere and expect that, you know, we'll get value over 20 years or anything. You have something, you wear it. I join also Paul in the sense that, you know, you have to wear it, you have to feel it. You know, it's not only on the catalog or keeping the watch in your hand. It's really you have to feel the watch on your wrist, and if you enjoy it, that will be much more easy to spend money on the thing. And then it's to, yeah, not to spend money like this, just find a watch which makes sense to your collection, find a watch that, you know, that's still a good value, that is still interesting. Yeah, and try to keep, I would say, I would end up saying that the most important is that you love the piece. You have to really, really enjoy wearing it.
And as a horological psychologist, what would be your advice?
Well, I agree with everybody here. The first thing, when you put a watch on your wrist, if you really love it, that's the number one choice. But behind that, I think you need to learn about the product. There's a lot of information out there online with forums, with the auction houses, my office. No, no, but there is a lot of information. Do some research before maybe you pull the trigger. I think the condition of the watch, like we've all been speaking about, is very, very important, especially with vintage. It's worth it to spend the extra money on a watch that's in mint condition as opposed to saving a little money on one that's average condition. But liking it first, the condition, and do some research.
And what better way to have USD collectors and experts here on the panel than to open up to the public, because all of the questions that I prepared, I might have 1/3 that I actually wanted to ask, so I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions from the audience having a panel like this here. So who would like to start? I think we have a mic coming in. Good, yell.
Where are you seeing the value proposition in the vintage watch collecting community?
Like in terms of which brand to buy next?
In terms, yeah, good value proposition.
So we do know we have to travel to Italy and then to La Chaux-de-Fonds. And now you also want to know which brands to pick. I mean, we already told you Italy, La Chaux-de-Fonds, now the brand. Anyone care?
Well, I feel like the brands that are right now putting a lot of money into their heritage are doing really well. For example, AP, Patek Philippe, other brands, Longines, some of the subsidiary brands, they've started museums and putting a lot of money into the history of their watches. Like, for example, Omega's doing tons of stuff right now with their museum, and they made that 1969 watch that went to the moon, the Speedmaster, and a lot of great, there's a lot of different models of Speedmasters that are going up every day. AP with the Royal Oak, it's a great model to buy. So, I mean, like William said, there's 800 watches manufacturers out there, and if you do with the proper research, you'll figure it out.
It's not a question of advice, but what is the watch that's in your collection that represents the most sentimental value to you guys? Which watch in your collection is the most sentimental?
Okay. Yeah, so which watch of our collection is having more sentimental value, right? Sorry. So for me, is a GMT Master by Rolex. It's the watch. If I had to keep one, I would keep this one. Don't ask me why. It's just a personal feeling, and I would always have a vintage GMT Master with me.
I have a watch that was given to me from my father. It's a Patek Philippe. It's called the Top Hat model. And what's that? He was a great father. And it's made of platinum, and it belonged to a famous singer named Bing Crosby. And it has a signature of Bing Crosby on the back of the watch. My father was really good friends with his golf pro, and Bing Crosby had given the watch to his golf pro, and then the golf pro gave the watch to my father, and now I have it.
So the most valuable watch I have, my Grail watch. Not a valuable, but for me personally, not in terms of money. It's a 6238 pre-Daytona steel black dial that my father gave me. Actually, it was a big thing to get this watch because he loved this watch, and I had to be a very good boy, good grades at school. And I remember the day my father was collecting some timepieces, and the day he said, "Okay, you've been a nice boy, you can pick up a watch." And he opened the first box, and it was something cool, but the second box, something cool. Then he opened this one, and went like, okay, I don't have to show that I really love this watch, otherwise it's going to be even harder to get. So after a couple of days of discussion, I picked the 6238, and it's always traveling with me, and it's my lucky watch.
Paul. Mine is an old Audemars Piguet day date with moon phase. It was the very first high-end top manufacturer watch that my dad had bought. And I just remember being absolutely fascinated with it compared to the Omegas, the Rolexes that we had purchased. This was the first from the holy trinity of watchmakers. The year was 1991, and I just remember holding that watch and just dreaming to one day own it. And when he finally, when I finally took possession of it, it just still brings back great memories.
My father will have said, "What kind of idiot buys a watch for $100?" So I don't have any of his watches. I think watches is just a material thing. It's not so important that you have to be attached to them. But if I had to choose, it would be none, to be honest. It's like kids. Or you like them all, or you don't like any of them. And you disown them. And it would be kind of the same with watches. I like all my watches, and I don't have one that is my favorite over another one. Having no family heirloom, I don't have a favorite watch.
Thank you. Any other questions?
My question is, all of you have a lot of knowledge on vintage watches and how the market changes with time. I'm aware that there's this trinity of watches, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, and Audemars Piguet. Do you think that in the near future there will be another brand that will become part of that trinity? Obviously it will not be a trinity, it will be a group of four, but do you see that based on historical record? Any of the panelists?
I mean, it's a little bit looking into the crystal ball. It's difficult. I'm not going to give you an answer, but by looking back, first of all, we've learned that collecting watches is a fairly young thing. Watches is a fairly old thing, but collecting them is different, even though it has always been something that people actually bought and kept. So we went from I mean, I remember the 80s where everyone was crazy about moire watches, wall clocks, or pocket watches, and then suddenly we had the Swatch craze. So it's fairly young, so I presume it's almost impossible to give a prediction, but I'm curious to see my colleagues answer your question.
What makes the Holy Trinity, in my humble opinion, is their continuous production since as early as 1755 for Vacheron, since I think 1875 for Audemars Piguet, and maybe 1839 for Patek Philippe. And this consistent history over all these decades of producing high quality timepieces, throughout their entire existence, to get that from another brand, it's just difficult. Lange is a wonderful brand, but they went for a period of 50 years, 50 some odd years, not producing watches. Unfortunately, not their own fault, but they have a break in their history. So I do think there are many great makers at that level, especially amongst the independent brands, but the Holy Trinity, these revered brands with these amazing stories over their history, for me, I think it's quite exclusive.
I'm going to echo what Paul said. I think the Holy Trinity is kind of like Ivy Leagues, where it's set in stone, but if you went to MIT or Stanford, you went to as good of a school as any of the Ivy Leagues. Okay, we have three big brands, been around for 200 years, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't really matter. From a collector point of view, I think Rolex now definitely stands out as like the leader. I think nobody will take that crown away from them for a while. Now it has been established that Rolex is going to drive this train. For how long, I don't know, but Rolex is there. Omega is coming. You have Mad Mansion, Longines. You have like all those brands. Dealers need to sell watches. People need to buy them. So you have to push other stuff. If watches are not available, you need to have other things. Patek was driving that train for the first 25 years. Rolex is coming now. You have another one in 20 years, or maybe even sooner.
If I may add, I think it's interesting because in your question, I also see all these historic brands are doing well and they continue to do well. And I think a couple of brands could also in the future become collectible because we see there is a strong interest in them, although they are not having 150 years history. I think one of them is Pigeon. I really see FP Jaune as a brand that is modern, having an appeal for the collectors, also for vintage collectors. And I see many people into vintage watches that are now very interested into FP Jaune, and it's holding its value at auctions, at least in the recent years. Some not, let's say, better than others. And
I collect FP Jaune. I mean, I have 8 FP Jaune. It's like my brand. I think FP Jaune is kind of coming as a collector brand. It's very young, it's 20 years old. The early stuff is very vintagey because he was making everything by hand. He was making very few of them. So you're looking at FP Jaune and you're saying, that stuff is like the early stuff that we were collecting, the early Rolex that we were collecting 20 years ago, the early Patek. FP Jaune is becoming, among the collector guys, very strong. But I don't know how long it will stay, and I don't know if it's sustainable because there's not so many watches out there for people to collect.
Any other questions? Maybe one more. Yes, Michael.
Real quick on the Holy Trinity, coming from Audemars Piguet's perspective, make your own Holy Trinity. It's a religious reference, so find your own religion. If it happens to be one of those brands, great, but really pursue those brands that speak to you. I mean, I had to say that real quick. But separate from that, I'm just quickly curious to get all you guys' perspectives. There's this sort of myth out there that vintage watches is on this even trajectory on the way up. But those of you guys up here on the panel know that many amazing watches are actually at 10, 15, 20-year lows. Amazing rectangular Pateks and Audemars, they're way down. Bubble backs are way down. Their Rolex Princes are way down from where they were. This is never really talked about in the community. I'm curious from your perspectives, what might be at a peak right now that, and this is, by the way, a result of the baby boomers aging. It's now the kids of the 60s and 70s and 80s buying watches. What's at risk? What in 20 years might be we looking back at saying, wow, that was a peak back in 2019?
Matt mentioned something early in this talk about lifestyle. I think it's very important. You want to have a watch you wear everywhere. You don't have to worry about it. Those early top hats, those very refined Pateks are fragile. And you wear 25, 26, you hit a wall. You cannot really go on a bike with this. You can break a dial that is worth 20 grand. So there's this aspect of breaking something that is rather fragile. But I agree, I think the prices have dropped so significantly that in a way, there's a lot of bargains out there now. Dealers are not pushing this stuff so much because they're not buying this stuff. It's pretty rare. So you don't see them a lot on Instagram, on social media, but there's definitely some bargains out there in the Patek. A simple round watch from the 50s, and square and rectangular watch with the 990 movement. That's an easy one to do. When you see a 990, you know it's one of those rectangular Patek.
Thank you so much. The question that I have for everybody here is, how do you guys feel about mistakes? And specifically somebody such as myself, I'm 28, 29. I don't believe I know what I like yet. So I'm scared to pull the trigger on something that I think I like because of social media, but I don't necessarily know, do I really like it because it's what I see on my timeline, or is this something that I like specifically because of what it is that I do or who it is that I want to become? So how do you guys feel about mistakes that somebody such as myself will make along the way?
It's part
That's
of the
how
journey.
you build a collection, making mistakes. I have thousands of them. No, just kidding.
It's part of the journey. Making mistakes helps us grow. And what you should be doing is educating yourself as much as possible and following your own road. Go visit dealers. Go to Matt's shop to see vintage. Go to authorized dealers. Get in there, try on those watches, talk to the guys behind the desk, talk to the collectors that walk in. Just focus on what resonates with you and only you.
but also
It's like bike. You cannot start riding a bike thinking, can I ride a bike and never fall? You will. You will fail. You will make mistakes. And it's really part of the fun, actually, because you learn from those mistakes right away.
But you will not make a mistake if you buy something that you actually like, especially in the age of social media, which is all about exposure and feedback. It's still your most personal piece of jewelry you can wear as a man. And it's the stories that you have linked to this piece. So you already reduce the risk by going for something that actually you like and not someone else.
And to add, I think, yeah, of course, you must buy what you like. You will make mistakes, and you have to make mistakes. But also, I don't know if for the other panelists it's the same. Your taste will evolve. So what you like today is not going to be the thing you like in 5 years or 10 years. So the catch and release thing that William was referring to, it's also part of the process. It's an evolutive process. It's an iterative process as well. So you have to pull the trigger once, and so many times also I made mistakes, or I changed my mind, and then I, catch and release, and then you narrow down things. But I think, again, the chase and the hunt is part of the fun.
And also, being a panel on watches, I've been asked to be on time, and I think that it being 5 o'clock, I want to personally say thank you to my panel. You have been wonderful. We've been talking about watches, and I think that summarizes Watches and Wonders quite well if we have an emotional discussion on something that we all love and share and cherish downstairs.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.